with your answers so that you know what's going on in your hive and what to do. Let's do this. Let's get everybody logged in. Les, hi, how are you?
I'm good.
With your answers. Hang on, let me do this. What's going on in your hive? Got some feedback because I'm trying to do something and it's, there we go. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
No feedback, hopefully. Good. So tonight we're gonna talk. We do this every Monday, as you know. We get everyone to ask their questions, and we have a theme to get us started usually. And today we're going to talk about honey and harvesting honey, when it's ready, how to do it, and the things you can do about that. So Les, welcome back, and just let us know your thoughts to get us started. And if everybody is on Zoom wanting to ask questions, you can type them in the chat window or raise your hand on the reactions and jump in to ask questions.
So what inspired me to think about honey is I have a number of friends with bees that have some honey, and they wanted to harvest it, and they wanted to know how much to harvest, and because they're in top bar hives, they're horizontal. And so I thought I'd just briefly talk about how the bees, start off in the winter real small. And as they expand, they put brood in almost every comb in the spring. And then they start building some combs that may just have honey in them. And then they start to contract the brood nest. Right about now, they're starting to contract a lot of the brood nest, backfill it with honey when the brood hatches or emerges. They backfill it with honey and begin to contract the brood nest and leave honey behind. And so then it becomes an issue of when can you take honey? I always like to get honey at the end of a bloom when it's capped, right? That's the first thing is you don't want to take uncapped honey very often. Sometimes I break a comb of uncapped honey, and I'll go ahead and sometimes the easiest thing to do is throw it in a little bucket I keep and take it home. But I know that it's not ripe, and I'll just use it up quickly. That's not a problem. And there's 8 of us in this house, so we can use it up pretty quickly. You can hear one of them, I suspect, right now. But so mostly we want primarily ripe honey that is 90% capped. In a very dry climate, you can get away with a little bit less capped. In a humid climate, it's dangerous because what happens is that if it isn't capped, it's still evaporating water out of it. And if you don't evaporate the water out of it, yeast can get active and it can ferment in your bottle. So you don't want to harvest uncapped honey.
I have a question, because sometimes you see honey that's either capped or not necessarily capped, and you've got a little bit of bubbles into the even capped honey. What is that?
Well, some bubbles come from when we harvest the honey, we put it through a strainer, we introduce air into the honey, and there's a certain amount of foam just from pouring it. And from the film, like when it forms a film on top and then the stream comes down through it and it mixes air and bubbles in, and that's pretty hard to avoid. And that doesn't hurt anything. But some of our honey, we have to be careful. Here we have relatively high humidity. And it is possible that even some capped honey isn't quite down to 18% by moisture content. And if it doesn't get down to that percentage, it may ferment on you in the jar, even though it was mostly capped.
So I've seen the bubbles into the cells, even capped, not
Okay.
from the extractions or the air introduced at extraction, but just present in the cells. And it was not at a high water content either.
I don't know. There's volatile. Something is turning into a gas down in the honey, and some volatile substance, if it isn't water or carbon dioxide. Well, most of the bubbles come from yeast converting sugar into carbon dioxide and vinegar, and the carbon dioxide is the bubble. But I don't know. There's a problem in the Amazon basin. They have a real problem with honey fermenting in the comb. The bees simply cannot get it low enough in moisture content to prevent fermentation. And so that's just a problem of living in 80-90% humidity all the time. It just can't be ripened. That's where the stingless honeybee lives. Their honey doesn't seem to ferment, and it's very watery. So they've introduced maybe a microbial substance, microbes that really do hammer the yeast and keep the yeast from fermenting honey.
That's clever. When I was in Africa doing the beekeeping, the teaching apiaries over there and trying to train people, that's one of the big issues is the high humidity in the air becomes really challenging when you're trying to, when you're extracting and you're trying to bottle that honey, it tends to ferment really fast and potentially they tend to use plastic bottles and those tend to explode because of it.
Right. And it's an issue. There's a solution, an industrial solution is you mix the honey in a machine that heats it slightly and drives off the moisture, and then you have a hygrometer and you test it until you get down to 18%. But that's not available to most people. I mean, you could heat it on the stove, but you're more than likely heating it beyond at least right at the bottom of the pot, above your denaturing enzymes. And that's a problem when you heat honey to dry it out.
Right. I wanted to show a couple of things that I've got a show and tell today. Here's my favorite tool for harvesting honey, because we do a lot of natural comb honey. So we do the cut comb, but we also do the crush and strain. And that's like my favorite of all times, putting all the comb in there. And actually what I like to use is I've got a big stainless steel pot with a sieve. That's for like making like couscous or steamed vegetables. And I basically slip this is a paint strainer nylon from just a 5-gallon bucket, and you can slide it over. And what I do is I crush all that comb in there, and now it's all draining at the bottom of my pot. So I can do a whole lot of it, and I can have several bags where I can just, when I've got one that's full, as long as it's the same kind of honey, to your point, I don't like mixing several types of honey, but then I can pull it out and put another one for more of that. And the wax, I'm going to let it drain in a separate bowl and then potentially wash it in a big pot as well to gather all that remaining honey that's sticking to the wax. And I've been known to freeze it so that I can make tea or lemonade or something like that.
We've also made something along the lines of kombucha tea with that honey, the wash, and then I've known people to make mead, but you have to get recipe, but they've rinsed all the crushed comb with a little bit of water and then made mead with it. Yeah. The other thing that comes in to play in particularly top bar beekeeping and a lot of beekeeping without a queen excluder is potentially brooding the honey. And so you just want to watch, and I never harvest. If I come to brood, I stop Now, there's been a time or two when I've seen a little bit of cap drone brood down at the bottom center, and I've gone ahead and cut that out, left it in the hive for it to emerge. But I don't like to see any brood larvae actually getting crushed and strained into the honey. That's a kind of a big no-no, because their protein isn't all that, it's not good for the honey. It could cause it to ferment again or to
Well,
go bad.
if you crush bees, you've got feces that are released into the whole mix too,
Yeah.
right? So that's kind of, you don't want to do that. You don't want to contaminate your honey. What's another thing that we need to keep in mind when we're harvesting? So you briefly mentioned what you like to harvest and up to where. How much do you like to leave for the bees? And do you do smaller harvests more often? Or do you do a big harvest once? Do you follow nectar flows? How much do you leave them for the winter? All those things.
So in my honey producing days, which haven't been in the honey producing mode much the last few years, but I had a lot of 48-inch long tupper hives with no partition, and they would build a lot of comb in the spring, and then it depends. Like if they filled the whole hive with a fair amount of mesquite honey, there's often a contraction after the mesquite, and then there was going to be another bloom right after that. I would try to harvest all the ripe honey as soon as possible as the mesquite was shutting down, before they mixed in the next bloom, which would be salt cedar, which is a completely different color and flavor. So mesquite honey is a bright yellow, very sweet, very mild honey. Salt cedar was greenish black, very strong, even somewhat bitter. But a lot of people really liked it, but it was very different from the mesquite. And so ideally we keep those separate. And that's where we watch the bloom, and as soon as the bloom tapers off and you have capped honey harvest, and then get ready for the next bloom to come in. But even then, there was a time when I had a bunch of mesquite honey, and I came to a hive that had a different honey, a dark red honey. And I kept that separate in a separate bucket. It's just a matter of cutting the comb into one bucket or another. So I kept all the red honey to itself. Later realized that that hive, for whatever reason, was working prickly pear cactus. Ooh. While everybody else was on mesquite. And it was a very noticeable difference in the flavor, color, even the texture. The prickly pear was much thicker. And so I kept that separate. There wasn't near as much of it. But I was able to then show people, well, here's a red honey, a kind of a dark red honey. It's almost ruby red. We saw some of that this weekend at the class, some fairly dark red honey that I'm pretty sure was prickly pear cactus that the bees were making honey from in the, well, getting close to Wimberley at the brewery there.
Driftwood,
150.
yeah. Mm-hmm. So that brings up a good point. You have a lot of varietals, and you can separate your honeys by season, by taste, by color, by floral majority, basically, and just kind of keep several jars. You can freeze them to preserve their freshness, label them very carefully so you know what, or you think you know what it is. You can have it analyzed to confirm, by the way, what's the majority of those flowers in your honey. And then you can organize a honey sensory, little event for your friends or family, or if you're a beekeeping business, you can use that as a class and just pair it with fruits, nuts, various things, cheeses, and kind of like do that. There's a whole wheel of honey sensory experience. There's a class that's being taught by an Italian school that's got an extension in the United States. The honey sommelier Her name is Maria Carla Marchesi. Marchesi is her last name. You can look it up, and that's a very interesting class, by the way. But it comes with a wheel of pairing, and so you can kind of analyze what's in your honey, a little bit like a wine sommelier, which is why she's calling herself the honey sommelier. So that's something to do and just kind of enjoy. I do have some questions, Les. Do you have time for a question?
Of course.
Okay, so Timothy in Oklahoma is asking, is there any danger for insect eggs hatching in harvested honey that is being stored in large buckets in the warm summer, such as hive beetles, wax moths, and hi, Timothy, it's good to see you.
Not in straight honey. If you have buckets full of beeswax with honey in it, you shouldn't, like, I recently went and helped a beekeeper with her hives, and we harvested some combs. And then she called me back 3 weeks later, and she hadn't emptied the bucket. She hadn't squeezed the honey out. So she brought that same bucket to harvest more combs. But that meant the combs that we harvested 3 weeks before were still sitting in the bucket.
Ooh.
And you could see wax moths starting on the top. They weren't down, they'll drown in honey, they need air. So they can breathe under the water, so to speak, down in the honey, but they can mine through what is up on the surface and make a mess of it. I said, well, we can't use that now. You've got to, I guess you could try feeding it back to the bees, but it's been kind of ruined. So ideally, when you harvest honey, you crush and strain it. I like to do it that day. If you store it somewhere in your garage, you could wind up losing a lot of it.
Really fast. How long does it take? Like a few days, like 5-7 days? I forget what the life cycle says, but I know it can happen really fast in the temperature too.
So there is a danger in that. But once you once you strain the wax out of the honey, now the hive beetles and moths can't survive in liquid. They need the beeswax and air. And so the stored honey in a bucket, you can store that for several years, many years actually.
In a place that's not too hot and away from light, right? You don't want to.
Ideally.
So the heat does. So honey over time, if it's too hot where it's being stored, will develop what is called hydromethyl HMF. That's going to be an issue for the honey, because it's going to be a toxic substance that's kind of toxic to humans and toxic to bees as well. So something you don't want to buy your honey somewhere where you think it's been stored in a hot room. That's something else. So that's why I like to put our honey into freezers, because that will kind of maintain it in a stasis and it will protect it for a long time. The other thing, right, Les, is you've got that liquid honey. So that, to answer Timothy, it doesn't allow the eggs from wax moths and larvae and small hive beetles from growing and just having those worms into your liquid honey. But to your point, the comb honey, you want to protect, right?
Right. So when you cut your comb honey, what I used to do is I'd come home, cut my comb honey right away that same day or that evening, put it in my containers, my clamshells is what I was tending to use. Put it right in the freezer and freeze it good and solid overnight. Take it out and let it thaw, but be careful because it will attract moisture out of the air. So I would sometimes cover it, make sure it's not open so that it thaws, because you know how a cold can of soda will collect moisture on the outside. Mm-hmm. So will your frozen comb honey, and you don't want it to absorb that moisture. Mm-hmm. So let it thaw, maybe covered under a plastic tarp or something. Get it back to room temperature so that it can get and then sold. And you don't have, if you have room in your freezer, you can leave it frozen for a while.
Mhm.
That just depends on how much room you got in your freezer.
Right.
Freezing it, if you don't freeze it, then you'll still have the same problem with wax moths and hive beetles
Really quick.
present in it. Yeah.
Something to keep in mind. So Richard Lacaba, sorry. Hey, Richard. He's asking, can you tell if the honey is from trees or from flowers? He thinks his recent harvest in Texas is from trees. He says it has a nutty taste, dark brown. And then I have a question from YouTube, actually. So we'll switch to that after your answer.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer in some ways. Now you can get your honey analyzed.
You do have a helper.
Yes, I always have help. It's a very hard, it used to be much harder to, now you can send it in if you're not so sure, and they may be able to tell you. But in the past, you had to watch your blooms, try to watch the pollen going in, to get out on a walk and go around and look at the flowers and try to catch the bees on the flowers, see what color of pollen they were gathering. Like right now, I'm seeing pale, very pale yellow pollen going into a lot of the hives in the hill country. And then I finally caught some on some Texas sage. So they're making some Texas sage pollen at least. I don't know how much nectar they're getting.
Yeah, that blooms after the rain.
The dark honey doesn't necessarily come, there are trees that make very dark honey, and there are trees that make very light honey, and plants that make very dark and very light honey. So you can't necessarily tell by the color. It's species specific. Each species of flower produces a very specific type of honey. And it really takes years of watching the bloom and tasting honey and watching the bees on the bloom to really get that down to a science. And that's where getting in old-time beekeepers really helps, because they've had years of experience that they've every time this comes into bloom, then we get this yellow honey, and it's very mild. And when it didn't bloom one year, we didn't make that honey. So now we pretty well are sure this is mesquite honey that's yellow. But it takes a lot of observation. It's not that easy.
Yep, it's experimentation, and by a process of elimination, you get those answers.
That's kind of where you need your old-time beekeepers that have been in the neighborhood for years, because they've been able to put together, get out and walk around and see the flowers, see the bees, and taste the honey as it's coming in. And over the years, draw conclusions and test them and figure it out. Yeah.
Right. So before I get to Doug's question, I'm reading the question I've got in YouTube. Max asking, just harvested a couple of tabars of honey that read 19%. What's the risk and timeline that honey fermenting? Just giving it away or keeping it for personal use? Should I advise people to freeze it?
That's right on the line. It's pretty safe, but it is a little bit. I've even known people to store honey in a hot room, in a warm room, not a hot room, a room that was, got up into, which isn't hard these days to get a room up into the 90s, and see if it doesn't dry out just a little bit before you bottle it. Because it will dry if it's in a dry enough air. I would try to dry it a little bit and then test it again.
Mm-hmm. But in doubt, he could potentially freeze it too, right?
You can freeze it, and also if you use it fairly quickly, it's not until you start seeing it bubble, and even when it bubbles a little bit, still sweet and good. It's just it might eventually get vinegary is the problem with it.
Right. So I've got a question from Doug. You want to unmute yourself, Doug, on Zoom and just ask away?
Yes, thank you. So I'm looking to do more comb honey this year, and I have some beautiful combs to harvest. And what I want to know was, Les said something about a clamshell. What do you guys use to put the, like, is there something I buy on Amazon? Is it plastic or glass or what, where, what would be the method? I just take it out of the hive, I lay it in this plastic container or clamshell and cut it. And what is that clamshell?
So,
Go ahead.
oh, I was going to say, because there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind. There's a shape like a metal square with a handle that you can get that has this shape that's standard to some of those boxes that are basically acrylic plastic, transparent to the shape of that. It's 4-inch square basically. Then they have half squares, which is 2 inches by 4 inches. And that's if you want to make it look really pretty and presentable, then you put your stickers and all the stuff. But you can always package it in, some plastic containers that are hopefully a little bit transparent, at least so people can see it through. You can do it several ways. The things that I would recommend is, no matter how you do it, especially if you want it to be looking professional and clean, is I would use some cookie sheets, big like metallic trays with some cookie racks, I think it's called, or something to drain the honey. So you cut your comb very delicately, put it over the rack so it drains out a little bit. And so you don't have a lot of honey kind of filling the box and bathing the comb honey. Although if you prefer it to be that way, you can do it as well, but it's easier to slide it into the box without getting the honey stuck all over the place. So if you drain that a little bit before, that will make it look a little bit more professional, I think. But yeah, I mean, you can go, there's supplier websites that offer those, and I think they're called cut comb boxes. And I can provide a link later to some of the ones that we get. And otherwise, you can just kind of get the container that you please. The other thing that you can do, by the way, we talked about how the wax moths and the small hive beetles don't, their eggs don't, their worms, their grubs, once the eggs hatch, don't grow into the liquid honey. You can get a jar of honey and put chunks of cut comb, right? The leftover, when you cut your comb from your top bars, for example, you have a lot of like misshapen pieces of comb honey. You can cut them in little cubes and put that in a jar and cover it with liquid honey. And at that point, you're not going to have that issue either. However, the one thing I would say is, that's called chunk honey. If you're going to do chunk honey, you want to make sure that you keep it either in a freezer or you sell it and consume it fairly quickly, because if the honey, especially if it crystallizes really fast, starts to crystallize around that comb honey, first, you're not going to see it anymore. Then when you're going to use that honey, you're going to find chunks of wax in the middle of your crystallized honey. So there's something to keep in mind. That's something to protect the chunk honey from the crystallization.
And do you put it on the cookie sheet in the field, or do you bring the entire top bar in and freeze it and then cut it?
So I used to carry a box for a top bar box, same shape and size, but no entrance, covered with top bars and a sheet to keep the bees out of it. And then when I came to a comb that had never had brood in it, so it was no dark center, dark wax, just in a nice, beautiful comb full of capped honey, I'd gently brush the bees off it to carry the whole comb to that box on the back of the truck, set it in there, replace it with an empty top bar. And sometimes I'd have 2 or 3 of those boxes full of combs of honey ready, capped honey ready to cut up. Then I'd drive it to the house or to my shed, lift each comb out, lay it down on a cookie sheet, and cut it into the 4-inch squares, and then put those 4-inch squares on a draining cookie sheet, let them drain for 10, 20 minutes, whatever, while I'm cutting more, and then transfer them to the clamshell, which is, Dedand and Man Lake all sell those 4-inch clamshells that don't have holes, similar to what you buy raspberries or blackberries in at the grocery store, but with no holes in them, obviously. They're made for honeycomb. That's a great way to sell honey. It sort of connects people back to nature. They can see how the bees made it. And it tastes really good and it's fun. And it can make you a fair amount of money for your, for your honey. It's worth a lot of money these days. So it's a good way to do it. Then of course freeze it, thaw it, and take it to the market and sell it.
So I am putting in the chat window the link to the acrylic looking plastic bottles that boxes that we use for our cacomb. They're very pretty, but then there's Man Lake and Data, which are the main ones, the main beekeeping supplies that Les mentioned. That's also an option, but I really like those clear looking ones. Naveen is asking why I'm putting the honey into the freezer rather than the fridge. Well, because in the fridge, it might tend to crystallize because the temperature can be, with the freezer, it suspends it. It turns it into basically glass. Honey doesn't necessarily freeze. Like if you tip the jar, it will ever so slowly start, getting out of the jar, but it's a glassy substance at that point, and it really protects it from crystallizing more than it would in the fridge. That's why it really suspends it and keeps its freshness. That's why I'm doing it. How is the honey analyzed and how expensive it is? I don't think it's very expensive. There's a few places where you can send it out. I will find the links and post them on the Be Mindful Facebook site and on the YouTube video afterwards as well, so that you guys have some ideas where to do that. I don't think it's super expensive. So Les Dan is asking, he says he's got 6 layers hives that he started as a packages this spring. He's going to requeen the end of June à la Mel DCL Cohen. He's the one that does the on the spot queen rearing, I think. How do I price each half of, I'm not sure. One would be a shook swarm with the queen. Oh, you're going to split. And one would be a shook swarm with the queen and all of the young bees that don't fly back to the original hive. The other would be the field bees with the resources to make a new queen. I'm not sure what you mean by how do I price each half.
So it sounds like he's trying to sell a lay-ins.
Nukes?
The shook swarm would be somewhat like a package.
Uh-huh.
And then a nuke with some comb and resources, and then potentially the new queen and the field bees.
Right.
But ideally, you'd wait till the new queen is laying and got some capped brood, because you want to see that brood capped. Mm-hmm. The price is a good question. You could look at the price of the shook swarm would be somewhat like a package. If you're going to, and I presume you're going to put it in a package. And then the other one sounds like, I don't know what you do about a lay-ins nuke. I suspect it's fairly expensive, but I'm not sure what the market is for lay-ins nukes.
Yeah, so all beekeeping is local is the same thing for this. What you can sell your bees for, whatever configuration you choose to sell them for, is going to be what the market bears. And it's also going to be if it's a niche market or not, right? So you're going to be able to sell your bees more if you've got treatment-free bees, for example, or if you're selling lay-ins hive nukes, or if you're selling top bar nukes, things that are not as common and more sought after for niche reasons, you might be able to increase your prices. Now, I would like to say, you're in southeast Nebraska, and you've got those lay-ins hives that you started in packages. Are you sure you want to split them this year? Because they might need all their resources to get through their first winter. It's really hard for packages to get started and gather enough food for themselves to get through the first year. Now, depending on your area, Southeast Nebraska, you might have an explosive nectar flow and food everywhere, and they filled up the entire box. And at that point, that's fine. But I just wanted to raise that point so that you kind of keep that in mind. You don't want to tax them too much. Now, if you're doing shook swarm and just bees, you're not really taking as much of the resources, but you're creating a package that's a later season package. Are those bees going to be able to make it if they don't have any resources? Your colony might still be fine, but your customer might not really be happy with the product you're selling them if these bees don't make it through the winter because they got that package late. And if it's a layers hive, it's a niche market. You might want to keep those bees and make nukes instead of shook swarms and things like that, because there's a lot of competition on the market for packaged bees, which yours, if you shake them with no resources, would be a package. So all those considerations, if you're trying to make a business out of it, is something that you want to keep in mind and analyze very carefully. And hopefully that makes sense. But I'm not sure exactly what your goals are. So that depends on what your goals are and the end game there.
Just quickly, the temptation, once you start trying to sell bees, often the market, there's plenty of people willing to buy them, and then you wind up stressing your bees quite a bit, dividing them too much, and it's better to keep them as strong as possible, and then they spit out a nuke every so often in a honey flow and let it be a surplus rather than cut it down and don't let them get too weak is the point. Because I've seen bees that have been split and split and split because there was plenty of market to buy them and plenty of market to sell them. Mm-hmm. But then the customer wound up getting 1.5 combs of bees, and it was to be careful. Just make sure they're good and strong. Keep your reputation high.
Yep. So Naveen's making a comment. She's been using the the wax foundation strips methods of guiding the bees onto the top bars. And yes, Wyatt Mangum has written a book where he mentions that method, but it's not necessarily Wyatt Mangum's method. It's been around for quite some time. So he just described it in his book, but it's not necessarily his method. But she says she had great luck with that. And she says the comb was perfectly straight and she had no problems in her 2 hives. And they built up really nicely, which also depends on your forage. But she did write up something about it. So she's got a little description on how she did it. And she's sharing that with everybody. So I'm going to copy that over in YouTube as well. Thank you so much, Naveen. We appreciate it. Thank you. And we're glad that that method works out really well for you. One of our other apprentices, Brad, has mentioned that sometimes that's not enough. Some bees, some colonies, and that depends on the genetics or what the bees are, doing, or sometimes they don't read the lines and the guides. They will still cross-comb some of those. It can happen with anything. Obviously, if you give them guides, you have higher chances of them following them. And that's a pretty strong guide. So that if you want to increase your chances, that's definitely a good method to do that. Yeah. So
yeah, it's a good method. And then with your management, if you catch it early when they're overriding your guide, that's easier to fix than if you let it go. But the beeswax strip is really a powerful incentive for them to build along that strip. So that's good.
Yep. Monty is asking, at what price do you typically sell 4-inch square comb honey? And Sherry's saying she's selling it at $106 per ounce. By the way, that's also based on your local market, on your marketing strategies. If you're telling and explaining, educating your customers about the values of cut comb, it's all a mix of all that stuff. It's also how much you want to sell it for, right? You get to decide part of that. And if it doesn't sell, then you decrease it a little bit. So you adapt. But in our neck of the woods, you go to the local farmer's market, you can sell one of those 4-inch squares for $45. So that's a huge, yeah, Les is like, that's not how much I was selling it for. Les tends to sell very cheap.
I remember selling quartz for $3 for years and years because they're 3 pounds, and that was considered a great price. Nowadays, I'm lost. I don't know what to sell honey for because I'm so behind the times that I don't even know.
Right. So the prices have gone higher, and it's all about your marketing and how you package it. If it's depending on the packaging, that's also going to make a difference. But yeah, about 40. So imagine that whole bar in the top bar, and you can do that with foundation-less Langstroth. We're talking a lot about top bars because that's what we specialize in, but we do that in Langstroth as well. And you can do that if you don't have foundation. Or they make some special foundation that's wax, but that's very thin, that you can put in your Langstroth honey frames that will give the bees that guide that we were just talking about. I personally don't like it because it's all commercial based wax, and I still think it has a little bit of a chewy kind of a texture. But mostly what I'm concerned about is the pesticides that beekeepers use that can be contaminating that wax. And then I'm not ingesting, right? So I don't want that in my wax. I want it pure foundationless because of it. So
that makes one comb worth like $200.
That's what I was gonna say. You're getting right up there. Yeah, exactly, Les. You can see the dollar signs. Les is laughing. Okay, so Matt is saying, I have a top bar hive with a nuke still on the shelf. And he's talking, I'm guessing, about the conversions that we've pioneered with the easy peasy Langstroth to top bar hive conversions that's done horizontally. The bees have been making good progress building into the top bar hive. Congratulations. The bar adjacent to the nuke is fully built out into the top bar. The one next to it is maybe 75% built out, and they have made a start on the third bar. Very good. It all depends on your nectar flow, how you've arranged the combs on inside your nuke, and on the genetics of your queen, obviously, as well. When I tried to move in the population levels in that colony, the strength. When I tried to move the bar adjacent to the nuke, I discovered that the bees had attached the comb to the outside of the nuke as well as the top bar. Yes, that happens. As a result, I tore the bar off of the comb. I'm not sure what to do about that. Suggestions? So it depends what's in there. If it's completely torn out and it's brood, you can take it and put it to the back of the hive, unless you can explain that, right? Because that's your specialty.
Yeah, sometimes if it's got brood in it, I'd be tempted to just, if it can sit, kind of slump down and sit right where it is, just leave it there.
It appears to be mostly honey. At least
Okay.
the side we can see appears to be honey.
If it's all honey, I would go ahead and move it, and it may come in pieces and make a kind of a mess if it's hot. But
So move it and just stack it at the back of the hive, or try and attach it to a bar, or
yeah, it's pretty hard to attach to a bar. I would set it towards the back of the hive, lean it against a wall so the bees can get around it, behind it, and then they'll clean it out and they'll keep building up where they're building. And they'll clean it out when they're not making honey. If they're still making honey, they may leave it full for a while and just sort of clean it up. But once they stop making honey, they'll go ahead and move the honey out of it, and then start on another one. And now you know that when you go to move that bar, take your hive tool and very gently pry it loose, or maybe even pull the comb out of the Langstroth section, a couple of combs out of the Langstroth section, and go in there and cut it loose anywhere that it might be attached before you lift it.
Okay.
And once they build 4 or 5 combs in the top bar section, particularly once I went through some today that had brood in them in the top bar section, you're getting close to where you could go ahead and pull the combs back, put the wall back, brush all the bees off the Langstroth box, combine them, the comb, if it has brood in it, into another box somewhere, another Langstroth box, or we like to keep the horizontal Langstroth hives around just to be receivers of a couple of combs of brood that we got from our conversions. And then basically you've already converted them. Now you have the queen and all the bees on a few combs in your tupar section, and you can take the shelf and put it back and take away the box, and yeah, you're done.
And I've done also honey harvesting in those nooks when they backfill that box with honey, and you have to manage them a little bit. Make sure you keep pushing that brood towards the tabar, and eventually they'll backfill the rest of the frames. Or you can harvest one at a time, keep pushing them. You kind of keep nudging them inside the tabar. Or if they still have a lot of brood and food, and you find a queen, you can take that, and you're in a time where your colony is exploding and you've got lots of resources and they look like they could be swarming, or they might be swarming already. Then you can harvest that as a split. So there's many options that you can do with that. Pauline, I don't know, French way or English way. I've been using just a simple barbecue wood skewers glued onto the bars, and the bees have been creating perfectly straight combs. She's used that technique with both tabars and wire hives. But just like I was mentioning too, that's fantastic. And sometimes it doesn't take much. And most of the bees will follow those guides, but sometimes they won't. And you might have to manage that. So if you catch it early, you can kind of push them back into line before it's too late. I have a question by the way, on YouTube. Matt is in Hayes County, and he has a colony that made an emergency queen and just now got to the point where she has capped brood again. The hive got fairly weak in the meantime, so he moved a couple of bars of honey from another hive into that one. But he's concerned about the dearths given the heat we're experiencing this summer. Should he plan to feed this hive? He's generally trying to avoid feeding, but he's concerned that this hive doesn't have the field bees to take advantage of any final nectar flows this spring. And what I would say before I let Les jump in is it's not necessarily about the amount of food you're putting in there. If there's a low population, but you put too much food in there, you might create more problems than it's worth. You want to boost them with numbers if you're concerned about the population levels, meaning if you have another hive that can donate some capped brood, for example, or along brood with nurse bees on that, that's what you want to do, right, Les?
Well, yeah, but make sure you don't transfer the queen by mistake.
Oh, yeah.
And a few nurse bees, but I wouldn't bring too many bees over. Mostly just, if you can find a comb that has some capped brood and some honey, give them a little boost, because that capped brood will emerge and join the new hive. And then, these bees in this area are pretty tough. So if you've got 3 or 4 combs and some brood and some honey, I'd let it go. And then if you get to where you don't see any resource, any honey anywhere, then yeah, you should feed them a little bit, but don't feed them just copious quantities to where they fill up the brood nest. And often they don't build very well on sugar syrup. They don't build comb. They fill what they've already got, but they don't keep building with just sugar syrup and no pollen. And we also have a chance at some bloom after the dearth. So the main thing is getting them through August right now. And then once we get to August, it may rain a bit and there'll be some goldenrod and some late flowers. So we tend to have a good spring, a hot summer, and then a pretty decent fall, and then a pretty short winter, and then back to next spring. And I've had them over winter on 4 combs, pretty full of honey and some little bit of brood. and actually get through. I don't recommend it, but I like to have 6 or 7 or 8 combs. I shoot for 9 actually in this area. I used to, in New Mexico, I always shot for 12, but we had longer winters in New Mexico. And here the winters are so mild that 9 is way enough. So 9 combs with a fair amount of honey and some brood on it, and they'll be fine. But I've gotten away with as little as 4. So don't overfeed them. Yeah.
Right. And to add one little point to that, if your hive is well insulated and is not doing a chimney effect, like we have some Langstroth 5-frame nukes, we call those winter nukes. They're on 2-inch lumber, 5-frame nukes. So they're very well insulated and there's not much space for the bees. I've overwintered basically 1 comb with honey, and that was an experiment. But that was just kind of enough for them to just kind of get by, and they ended up doing okay, getting through the spring. So that was something to keep in mind as well. But you want to err on the side of caution, especially if your hive is not well insulated, and especially if it's vertical configuration. Naveen is asking, you mentioned the high prices of comb honey. Is that a reason for the recent fascination with cathedral hives, which seem to result in huge pieces of comb? So I would say just the configuration of those cathedral hives is fascinating. I think you can get just as much comb honey in Langstroth and Tabar and Ware and Layens. So I don't think that's necessarily what the fascination is. Although they do look beautiful and they're gorgeous, you know, the way that hexagon looks really cool. But I don't know. What do you think, Les?
I'm interested in the cathedral hives, but only as an artwork.
As a novelty.
They to me they're beautiful, and they obviously the bees don't care and they like them just fine. But they're very expensive. Mm-hmm. And very hard to make. Like they're not something that is easily made. And so it isn't the solution to lots of people keeping bees in the future, because many people couldn't afford it or couldn't manage to do it. And so that's why I stick with the top bar hive, because it's very simple and still very productive. You know, if you can, I've opened up top bar hives and had 25 combs full of honey, and the last 10 combs were solid capped honey and never had brood in them, which made them ideal for comb honey, which now that's like $2,000.
Yeah, because those are huge.
Yeah, well, you get about 5 out of each, 5 cut comb boxes out of each frame or each comb. And so, and then the rest of the honey, I just cut in the bucket and bottled as bottled honey, because it was in comb that was dark or had brood in it, and you wouldn't want to make that into comb honey because there's cocoons in it, right? And you don't want to necessarily chew on the cocoons.
Yeah. So, by the way, Naveen is in our apprenticeship program, and Dwayne is also in our apprenticeship program. He's our we're outsourcing all our hive making to him now, because we don't make money on the woodenware. And I got him for the holiday season as a thank you for everything, the plans for the cathedral hives. And now I've got to convince him to build it, and it's super complicated. You should see those plans. It's like architecture drawings. And once he does have the time and finds the mustard to build those, we'll have one of the teaching apiary as well. Les, did you know that?
I didn't know that. And poor Dwayne.
Yeah.
You know, he also helped me with the design of the
solar wax
melter, and he had some really good ideas. I'm glad he was there, because everybody always shows a solar wax melter with the long axis up and down,
Mhm.
He said, well, that just creates more shadows. And I said, well, you're right. So we turned it sideways. And that way you have a little less, you have a little, just a better, very simple thing. So Dwayne's a great guy. And he also is a real woodworker. And I'm a beekeeper that has to work wood when I have to.
So I wanted to say to Mac, thank you for your kind note on YouTube. He's joining us on the plane and he's about to land, so he's going to miss the end. But you can come back next week on Monday, and we're glad that we had you for the short time that you were able to, most of it actually, because we've got only 4 minutes left. So safe travel, safe landing. And then it's time for our last few questions. I know Doug's got his hand up. You want to jump in with your question?
Sure. I want to ask a question about something Les just said. When taking honey that you want to make comb, he was talking about there were 10 in the back that had never been touched. My hives are only a year old. And so some of my combs I moved last year to the back because they're a little misformed. If they've been used like once or twice, or if they've had a season of having brood in them, is that going to make them not good for comb? And then if I'm trying to decide if I should or shouldn't pull a comb, if I decide, well, maybe I'll wait until September to pull it, is there any risk that it's going to go bad or something between over the summer heat? Should I pour more combs now when I'm trying to decide what to take?
Those are two good questions. I tried to keep away from any comb that had brood in it. You can always tell because it's darker. It may not be very dark. That's just a judgment call. If it's pretty light, just keep in mind that there is cocoons mixed with the wax. And ideally, comb honey is just beeswax filled with honey and no silk cocoon in there. And so I would be leery of any comb that had brood in it being used for comb honey. I don't think there's anything wrong with waiting until September. In some ways, that's the safe thing to make sure how they come through August, right? Because we got to get our bees ready for July and August now that we're going to get into, and it appears that we're in for a fairly warm, well, hotter than heck summer.
Yeah, 106 the high today, I think I heard.
Yeah. I was at 104 according to my pickup thermometer. And it's just getting too hot. It's getting too hot to work bees. It's not good for the bees. They'll get mad if you just try to work them when it's really hot, because they're in danger. You're making them vulnerable to losing brood. And then, so if we get through September and you see what they've eaten and what they've got left over, I think that's probably a safe time to then go ahead and harvest the honey.
So there you have it, guys. And with that, hopefully that was a fun chat with the Mindful Beekeepers again, and that we got some really good questions from the crowd. So thank you so much for all your questions. Thank you for joining us every Monday. We'll do that again next week. If you have any questions, email them to us at BeMindfulHoneyFarms@gmail.com. And so thank you for joining us tonight. And above all, thank you so much, Les, for sharing your expertise and taking the time to answer our questions today.
Thank you. And thank you, Natalie, for setting this up. And good seeing everybody. And I'll see you all next week.